Have you ever felt a sudden pull, like something was trying to stop you? Picture this. You're standing at the edge of a choice, the kind of choice that seems simple. Go or stay, speak or stay silent, turn left instead of right. And yet, deep inside, something moves, a whisper without a voice, a weight in your chest, a feeling you just can't explain. What if the last thing you felt was not fear, but a message? Today's story is about that moment, the kind that changes everything. A real story, a real person, and a real angel sign before tragedy, not a dream, not a fantasy, just a quiet warning, delivered in the loneliest place on earth. Julián never wanted to be found. After losing his younger sister without warning, he packed a bag, disappeared into the mountains, and told no one. All he wanted was silence, to forget the world and disappear into grief. But the mountain had other plans. In the stillness of the Sierra de los Vientos, something stirred. It wasn't the wind. It wasn't his mind. And just before the point of no return, something reached him, a sign, a message, a presence. Some people say it was fate, others call it coincidence. But those who've lived it know. Before the worst happens, sometimes the universe sends a sign. If you believe in guardian angels, fate, or simply want to hear real stories of life-changing moments, subscribe to Saved by a Sign and stay with us for today's powerful story. The first sign was easy to miss, not loud, not sudden, just off. Julián had walked that mountain path since he was a boy. He knew every bend, every stone, every pine that reached toward the sky like tired arms. But that morning, the air felt thinner, colder. The trees stood too close together, as if they had crept silently during the night to block the way. And then there was the stone. It wasn't supposed to be there, not in that spot, not with that mark. A spiral, etched into the rock as if carved with care long ago, worn but unmistakable, a shape that seemed to pull the eye inward. Julián stopped. He crouched down, ran his fingers over the groove. It was cold. Colder than the air, colder than stone should be. He stood in silence, the forest holding its breath. No birds, no rustling, only the faint whistle of wind through needles, like a whisper through teeth. Something inside him stirred, a voice maybe, or just a feeling. You're not alone. But he kept walking. He told himself it was nonsense, his mind still tangled in grief, still trying to give meaning to emptiness, still hearing echoes that weren't there, and yet the path didn't feel like the one he knew. The trail tilted where it used to be flat, the moss clung to the wrong side of the trees, and the air, it had a smell, sharp and metallic, like rain before a storm that never came. The sky too had changed. The sun was still high, but shadows grew longer, too long, as if something unseen blocked the light in places he couldn't name. He walked faster, heart tight in his chest. But the faster he walked, the heavier his steps became, like the earth was trying to hold him in place. Then came the second sign, a flicker. He glanced left. Between two trees far beyond the trail, something white moved, not a person. Not an animal, just fabric drifting in the still air, like the hem of a dress caught on a memory. He stopped. It was gone. He should have turned back. Every instinct told him to. But guilt has a strange way of silencing reason. And Julián carried too, much of it to listen. He pressed forward deeper into the trees. That's when the wind stopped completely. The silence became thick, almost physical. And then he saw it. Another spiral, this time not on stone, but on bark. A tree near the edge of a ravine. The mark pulsed in his mind. He didn't know why, but it felt familiar. Not from life, from somewhere else. He reached out, touched it, and then a sound behind him, soft, deliberate, like a footstep not meant to be heard. He turned. Nothing, but the world felt different. The forest, once familiar, now seemed to breathe around him, and suddenly he remembered something. A dream he'd had as a child, a dream of a white spiral on dark stone, a path that vanished if you looked too long, and someone calling his name softly from beyond the trees. He whispered aloud, barely a breath. Lucia. His sister's name. He hadn't spoken it in weeks. The moment cracked. The weight in his chest broke like glass. Tears blurred his eyes. And in that exact instant, the ground beneath him shifted. One more step and he would have fallen. There, inches from his boot, the trail crumbled away into nothing. A hidden drop, jagged and deep, masked by leaves and shadow. A place no map marked, a place he never remembered being there. He fell to his knees, not from weakness, but from the overwhelming, undeniable truth. He had been stopped, not by luck, not by chance, by something that knew. He looked back. The spiral on the tree was gone. So was the strange light. The air warmed slightly. Birds returned, life exhaled. He sat there for a long time, knees pressed into the earth, heart still racing. Not asking why, but who? Who sent the spiral? Who pulled him back? Who whispered when no one was near? He doesn't tell many people what happened that day, not because he's ashamed, but because words still feel too small. But deep in his soul, Julián knows this. He wasn't alone. Not then, not now. Something walked beside him. Something that saw the fall before he reached it, and left a quiet message carved into stone, bark, and silence, so he would choose a different path. Some call it a dream, some call it instinct, but some call it an angel sign before tragedy. It was just after the 3rd hour. The forest had thickened, and the light was fading, even though the afternoon sun still lingered somewhere behind the clouds. Julián moved carefully now, not because he was afraid, but because something felt off, as if the trail itself had begun to resist him. Then it happened. A patch of damp ground, gravel beneath his boot. He slipped. The fall wasn't violent, but sharp enough to steal his breath. He landed hard on his knee, the sharp stones biting through the fabric of his pants. A quiet gasp left his lips, more from surprise than pain. For a moment all he heard was the sound of his own breathing, shallow, uneven. Then a voice, soft, calm, female, not loud, but unmistakably real. "Don't go that way." Julián froze. He stayed completely still, hand pressed into the dirt, listening with every cell in his body. But there was nothing else. No footsteps, no crackling leaves, no rustling brush. Just the whisper of a breeze brushing through the trees like a question left unanswered. He turned slowly, scanning the forest, empty, and yet his skin tingled. Not from cold, but from something deeper. A presence. As if the very air had shifted when those words were spoken. He looked toward the path he had planned to take, the one just beyond a broken log, shadowed and narrow. It was the logical route, the only visible way forward. He had no reason to change direction, except that voice, except the way it spoke, not in warning but in guidance, almost like care. He stood slowly, brushing dirt from his hands, his knee aching, and without really knowing why, he stepped away from the path he'd been following. He didn't overthink it. Something inside him, deeper than reason, pulled him gently in, the opposite direction. The new path wasn't even a trail, just a narrow line between trees where the undergrowth hadn't grown too thick. It felt forgotten, untouched, but somehow safe. He kept walking, and with each step, the silence around him grew less heavy. The trees opened, the wind returned. A distant bird called out as if to tell him, "You're back on the right road." He didn't look back. Not yet. It was only later, hours later, when the sun began to dip and the cold pressed close again, that he'd understand what he'd been saved from, that original trail, the one he almost followed. It wasn't a path at all. It was a wash, a hidden runoff from the cliffs above, slick and unstable. A landslide had happened there just 2 days before. Rocks had fallen. Earth had collapsed. A warning had been posted down at the ranger station, but Julián had never stopped to read it. If he had kept going, if he had stepped forward just a little more, he doesn't like to finish that thought. All he knows is this: that voice didn't come from him. It wasn't memory or fear or guilt echoing in his mind. It came to him when he needed it most, when no one else was near. A voice without a face, but full of presence. Was it his sister, somehow still watching over him? An angel? A memory turned divine? He may never know, but one thing is certain: something spoke, and he listened. It came without warning. No breeze, no shift in sound, just a sudden silence. And then the mist. It rolled in like a slow breath, curling through the trees, swallowing the forest in pale grey until the world itself seemed to vanish. Within seconds, Julián could barely see his own hands. Beyond 2 steps, there was nothing. Only the heavy veil of fog, still and thick like smoke that didn't rise. He stopped moving. His heartbeat quickened, not from danger, but from the kind of fear that doesn't need a reason, the kind that grows in silence. Around him, the trees became shapes, towering, twisted shadows without edges. What once felt like forest now resembled ruins, as if the world had broken apart while he blinked. The air changed, too. A strange scent clung to the mist, cold, dry, and metallic, like iron, like old keys, like something forgotten. Julián tightened his coat around him. It wasn't just for warmth. He held it like a memory, like something solid in a world that no longer obeyed the rules of space or time. He found a flat patch of ground and sat. Not to rest, but because there was nothing else to do. The fog had erased the trail, the horizon, and any sense of direction. It was just him now, and the echo of his own breath, shallow and uneven. He tried to steady it, counted slowly in his mind. But that's when it crept in. Not the cold, but the emptiness. It wasn't the forest that frightened him. Not really. It was the silence inside him, the kind that had followed him ever since Lucia left. For the first time since he began this journey, Julián felt it fully. The ache, not in his knee, not in his muscles, but somewhere deeper, a hollow space behind the ribs, a grief without shape, without voice. The forest had gone quiet, but it was the inside of him that felt loud, full of all the things he hadn't said, hadn't faced, hadn't forgiven. And in that stillness something changed, not in the fog, not in the forest, but in him. The fear stopped feeling like panic and started to feel like grief. He didn't cry, he didn't speak, he just sat, eyes closed, shoulders shaking, as the mist moved around him like water around a stone. Then something strange happened, a warmth. It wasn't from the coat, and it wasn't from the sun. The sky remained pale, hidden, cold, but something touched him. Inside, a sense of being seen, not watched, seen, like a presence had arrived, not to frighten him, not to guide his feet, but just to be with him. In that moment, in that fog, in that ache he hadn't yet named. And slowly, the fear began to soften. The mist still hung heavy. They said forest was still lost to the eye, but Julián no longer felt alone in it. Something had found him in the silence, not with words, not with signs, just with stillness. And it was enough. Later, when the fog lifted and the path slowly reappeared, not suddenly but in gentle pieces, he would look back on this moment as the beginning of something, not a miracle, not an answer, but a pause, a sacred pause, where fear became honesty and loneliness turned into prayer. One he never meant to say, but that somehow was heard. And though the mist would come and go again in his life, that memory of being held by something unseen in the quiet would never leave him. Because sometimes the sign isn't what saves your body. Sometimes it's what steadies your soul. He reached into his coat pocket with cold, trembling fingers. The old watch was still there, the one Lucia had given him on his last birthday before everything changed. Worn brass edges, a glass face slightly scratched from time. It was never about precision. What Julián loved most was the quiet ticking it made, a gentle, rhythmic sound that reminded him he was moving forward, even when life stood still. But now, silence. No ticking, no movement. He held it to his ear, hoping to catch even the faintest beat of time. Nothing. The air around him felt heavy again, like the mist hadn't left entirely. And in that moment, a strange thought wrapped itself around his heart. Time hadn't just stopped on the watch. It had stopped in him. He stood very still. The forest held its breath, the branches unmoving, as if the world had slipped into a space between seconds. Even the wind, which had returned just minutes ago, faded again into silence. He turned the watch over in his hand, then back to its face. 4:44. The hand sat perfectly still, frozen in place, and something inside him shifted. A whisper, not a sound, but a knowing. The kind of recognition you feel in your bones before your mind can name it. There was something about that number, that moment. He didn't know why it mattered, but it did. He blinked, gaze fixed on the unmoving dial, and that's when it happened. He saw him, a figure, not far, just beyond the next cluster of trees, standing still in the pale light that filtered through the branches, cloaked in shadow, but not threatening, silent and watching. Julián's breath caught. He didn't move. The figure wasn't walking, wasn't calling, just there, present, like the forest had birthed it in that very moment, not a second before, not a second after. His first instinct was to call out, but something held him. Not fear, but reverence. He lowered the watch slowly, and without realizing it, he placed a hand over his heart. There was no doubt now. This wasn't a memory, and it wasn't imagination. Something had aligned. The silence, the stillness, the number, all converging like a thread pulled tight. He blinked again. The figure was gone. The trees stood empty once more, gently swaying now as the wind returned in soft waves. He looked back down, 4:44, still frozen. But in that moment, Julián no longer cared if the watch would tick again, because what he felt wasn't about lost time. It was about something given, a pause, a message, a presence. He didn't know who the figure was or what it meant, but somehow, in the deepest place inside him, he understood. He had been seen, not by chance, not by the forest, but by something beyond it, something that chose to speak through silence, through symbols, through a broken watch that stopped exactly when it was meant to, not a second too soon. And from that moment on, he would never look at time the same way again, because sometimes the loudest signs come not in thunder, but in stillness. The mist had returned, softer this time, almost gentle, like a veil pulled slowly over the world. Julián stood still, wrapped in the silence, eyes scanning the warped silhouettes of trees that bent like tired bones around him. Everything felt suspended, like the forest had exhaled and chosen not to inhale again. And then it appeared. Between the twisted trunks and drifting fog, a figure. It didn't walk. It didn't emerge with sound. It simply was, motionless yet alive, still, yet full of presence. There was no face, no features he could describe, just form and light. A soft golden light that shimmered gently, as if it breathed from within the figure, not casting shadows, not piercing the fog, but warming it. The glow wasn't harsh or blinding. It felt familiar, like a memory made of light. It wasn't from this world. Julián knew that instantly. And yet, it didn't frighten him. The figure didn't speak, not with a voice, but it raised one hand, slowly, gracefully, and pointed to the left, toward a narrow opening between thorny bushes, half hidden by moss and roots. A way Julián hadn't seen before. He didn't move, couldn't. His breath caught in his throat, his eyes blurred with tears he didn't expect. Because in that light, in that silence, he recognized something, not with his eyes, with his heart. It was her, not Lucia's body, not even her shape, but her essence. That gentle way she had of comforting without words, the way she used to sit beside him in silence when he couldn't speak, the warmth in her presence, the lightness, the tenderness, it was all there, carried in the stillness of this being. His knees softened, his chest ached. He cried, but not from fear. He cried because some part of him that had been closed for so long opened, because something sacred had touched the part of him that still remembered love. A thought came to him then, not his own, not from memory, but from somewhere deeper. Trust. That was all. He didn't question it. Not this time. Julián stepped toward the path the figure had shown. The branches moved aside without resistance. The air felt warmer, softer. Even the mist seemed to ease, as if it too understood. When he looked back, the figure was gone. No trace, no sound, only the faint echo of golden light lingering in the trees like the final notes of a lullaby. But he didn't need to see it again. What had appeared in that moment, in that space between fear and faith, would never leave him. Because sometimes the clearest signs are not meant for the eyes, they're meant for the soul. And Julián's soul, still broken, still healing, had finally felt something it thought it had lost forever. Guidance, presence, and a quiet whisper of love, glowing just beyond the fog. He didn't know how his feet began to move. He only knew that he was no longer choosing them. Something deep inside, older than thought, quieter than fear, answered the gesture of the glowing figure without hesitation. And as Julián stepped toward the narrow passage between thorns and brush, the branches seemed to part softly, as if breathing with him. Each step was slow, reverent. The forest no longer resisted him. It welcomed him. The twisting path curved sharply to the left, so narrow he had to brush aside ivy and duck beneath a low arch of roots. He expected nothing, he only followed, and then he saw it. A clearing, small, silent, hidden away like a secret never meant to be found. The light above was filtered through the fog and branches, giving the space a soft grey glow, almost like moonlight, though it was still day. And in the center, half swallowed by earth and moss, stood an old wooden cross, weathered, cracked, but still upright. Time had touched it, but hadn't taken it. Julián moved closer. To the right of the cross, tucked against a small rise in the earth, was a wooden shelter. Simple, bare, almost invisible behind the vines that clung to its sides. But its roof was whole, its door still hung in place. He opened it gently. The hinges groaned but held. Inside, dust, the scent of old bark, the faint perfume of moss and soil. He stepped in, closed the door behind him, and sat down. It was the first time he'd allowed stillness to touch him, without resistance. Not because he had to stop walking, but because something inside him had let go. No more pretending to be strong, no more pushing grief away with silence. He buried his face in his hands and wept, not in panic, not from fear, but from the kind of sorrow that finally feels safe enough to be seen. Tears slid down his cheeks freely, as if they had waited for this place, this moment, to be released. For weeks, he had held them like stones in his chest, and now they fell, like rain. Outside, the mist grew thicker again. The world beyond the clearing dissolved into grey, but inside the shelter, there was peace. Not comfort, not happiness, but something sacred. Like being wrapped in a blanket woven from memory, presence, and something invisible that had guided him here without words. He looked once more toward the cross through the window, barely visible through the fog. And though he said nothing, something within him whispered a quiet prayer. A thank you to whoever, or whatever, had sent him this path. A hidden way through sorrow, a shelter not from the storm, but from the silence. Because sometimes the sign isn't a miracle. It's a place, a pause, a clearing in the chaos, where grief can finally speak and be met with love. That night, wrapped in the silence of the shelter, Julián drifted into a sleep deeper than any he had known in weeks. The forest outside held its breath. No wind, no birds, only the faint hum of peace, and something else, waiting, just beyond the veil of dreams. And then he saw her. Lucia. She was standing at the far end of a long corridor made of mirrors, each mirror taller than him, framed in old gold and arranged like a sacred procession. The air was soft and blue-toned, and each step echoed like memory. The mirrors reflected not just his face, but versions of himself he barely recognized. In one, he was covered in dirt and tears, fists clenched with anger. In another, he looked younger, full of fear, reaching for something just out of frame. One version sat motionless, eyes hollow. Another screamed in silence. So many selves, so much pain. And yet, Lucia moved through them gently, like light walking across glass. Her presence was calm, unchanged by time or distance. She smiled, not with her lips, but with her eyes, the way she always had. He tried to speak, but his voice didn't work. She came closer. The mirrors shimmered around her. When she reached him, she placed a hand over his heart. Soft, warm, grounding. And then she spoke. You didn't come here to get lost. You came to find yourself. Her voice echoed not in his ears, but in his bones, like truth long buried, finally remembered. Tears welled in his sleeping eyes. The corridor of mirrors faded into white, and for a moment, everything was still. Then, morning. Julián's eyes opened slowly. The first thing he heard was the sound. Tick, tick, tick. He turned his head toward the watch. It was ticking again, soft, steady, alive. The hands had moved. Time had resumed, as if the watch had been waiting for him to remember something first, something only the dream could unlock. He sat up, rubbed his eyes. Outside the shelter, the light was golden, and the world looked entirely new. The mist, the endless heavy mist, was gone. Not faded. Gone. The trees stood clear against a bright sky. The air smelled of pine and morning earth. The forest, once twisted and distant, now felt open, kind. And though Lucia was no longer there, her words still echoed in him. You came to find yourself. And maybe, just maybe, he had. Because sometimes the voice of an angel doesn't shout from the heavens. Sometimes it comes quietly, through a dream, through a mirror, through the memory of someone you love, reminding you that you're not broken, you're becoming. Morning came gently. No fog, no shadows, only the quiet hush of early light filtering through the trees, touching the earth with gold. Julián stepped out of the shelter with a kind of calm he hadn't felt in months, not the absence of grief, but the presence of something stronger than it. Peace. The path home revealed itself slowly, as if the forest had decided to soften its edges. The soil, once damp and uncertain, was now dry and firm beneath his boots. The air, once metallic and heavy, smelled of pine and new beginnings, and for the first time the forest didn't feel like a place to escape into, but a place he had passed through, changed. Each step was deliberate, quiet, but not heavy. And then, halfway through the descent, he saw it, a stretch of trail he would have followed had he not listened to the voice, had he not seen the spiral, the light, the hand that pointed left. It was a steep slope, and something had clearly happened there. The earth was torn, chunks of rock littered the hillside, and a tree had splintered near the bottom, bark stripped clean. The path itself was broken, lost beneath a scar of fallen debris. Julián slowed his pace. His eyes followed the trail of disturbed soil down to the base of the slope, and there, something blue caught the light. He stepped closer. A backpack, worn, faded. The kind of blue that had once been bright. It lay twisted near the shattered remains of a tree, half buried beneath branches and soil. Beside it, a torn strap, a rusted canteen, a single hiking boot. It wasn't his, but someone had been there, someone who hadn't turned left. A sharp breath caught in his throat. He stood in silence, the forest once again holding him in stillness. There was no need to imagine what could have happened. The answer lay there at his feet, quiet, final. He didn't cry, he didn't panic. He simply felt the full weight of what he had been spared. Not because he was lucky, not because he was clever, but because somewhere along the way something had intervened. A whisper, a spiral, a voice in the fog, a dream with meaning, and a figure made of light. All of it, every sign, had guided him to this. A moment, to life, and someone else hadn't received the same grace. Julián stepped back, hand pressed over his chest, not in fear, but in reverence, because now he understood. The signs weren't about escape, they were about purpose, about knowing when to stop, when to listen, when to trust the invisible. Because sometimes the clearest evidence of a miracle is found in what never happened. Julián never returned to that mountain, not because he feared it, but because some places don't need to be visited twice, not when they've already carved themselves so deeply into your soul. He carries the story with quiet reverence now, not as a warning, but as a kind of thank you. A thank you he never got to say out loud to whatever voice, force, or unseen presence stepped in when he couldn't see the way forward. The old watch, the one that stopped ticking the moment he saw the figure and began again only after the dream. It still rests on the table beside his bed. It doesn't always keep perfect time anymore, but when it marks 4:44, Julián always notices, and he smiles, because that number, that silent golden hour between fear and clarity, means something to him now. It's not about clocks or minutes or numbers on a dial. It's about that pause, that sacred moment when everything could have gone wrong, but didn't. And once in a while, late at night when the world is quiet and his thoughts drift toward memories of Lucia, he still hears it. That voice. Soft, familiar. Not outside him, but somewhere within. I'm still with you. He doesn't know if it was God, an angel, or the echo of his sister's spirit reaching through time one last time to guide him home. But maybe the name doesn't matter. Maybe what matters is that something answered when he needed it most. Something stepped in, not with thunder or lightning, but with quiet signs, a broken trail, a spiral in the stone, a voice in the mist, a figure made of light, something that turned a moment of despair into a path of return. And whether it was divine timing or a guardian's whisper, Julián was spared, not because he was looking for a miracle, but because one found him. Maybe you felt it too. A hesitation before stepping into the street. A dream that didn't feel like just a dream. A sudden change of heart that saved you from something you didn't see coming. Maybe, like Julián, you've been protected without even knowing it. So now we ask you, have you ever experienced a sign like this? Do you believe it was just coincidence or something divine? What would you have done if it had been you standing on that mountain? Do you think angels try to guide us, even when we're too hurt to listen? These questions don't need answers, not right away. They're meant to be carried, to rest softly in the back of your mind, to rise when you least expect them. In a quiet moment, in a gentle dream, in a feeling you can't quite explain. Because the truth is, we're not here to explain the unexplainable. We're here to hold space for it, to honor the mystery, to believe, even just a little, that something or someone is always near. If this story touched your heart, don't let these signs go unnoticed. Subscribe to Saved by a Sign and stay with us to hear more real stories of faith, mystery, and the moments when life whispers, just in time. Thank you for staying until the end. But remember, there are stories that aren't just meant to be heard, they're meant to be felt. We'll see you in the next one, if you're still listening.